Hello and welcome to this session on How Should Government Be? The New Levers of State Power. My name is Michael Kitson. I'm an economist from the Judge Business School, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this event today. So this is a very important topic, the role of the state. How do we make governments more efficient and effective? A particularly important topic in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic and what the world would look like when we eventually come out of this pandemic. So with me today are three important experts on this area, which I'll introduce in turn. Our plan is to have a conversation here amongst the four of us for about 30 minutes, then we'll open it up for Q&A. So think about your questions and type them as they come to your mind. So we've got three distinguished guests today. First, Dr. Tanya Filer. Tanya leads the Digital State Project at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy here in the University of Cambridge and is a founder of StateUp. So welcome, Tanya. Tell us why you're interested in this topic and tell us what StateUp do.
Sure, absolutely. Well, it's great to be here and really looking forward to the conversation. The Digital State Project, first of all, which you mentioned, focuses on thinking about and hopefully improving the capacity of governments as users and developers and procurers of digital and emerging technologies. So very much focused on that government technology juncture. And I think, I became really fascinated in this topic because one of the kind of key problems that I see with governments is around knowledge and relationships, to put it rather simply, what they need to know and how they can know it, particularly in a digital age, and what kinds of relationships they need. So both with outside suppliers and partners, but also, of course, with citizens as well. So those are some of the kind of questions that I've been really motivated to answer. And I founded StateUp really with the kind of express aim of thinking through how can we help governments with those questions of knowledge and relationships. So StateUp is a company that focuses on GovTech, government technology, from the perspective of research and analysis and intelligence, and it really tries to bridge that gap between the worlds of governance and technology. And hopefully I'll get to tell you a little bit more about it during the course of the conversation.
I'm sure you will, Tanya. Yeah, thank you. Second guest, Jaideep Prabhu. Professor Jaideep Prabhu is a professor of marketing. Jaideep, why is a professor of marketing interested in this?
A really good question, Michael. So again, delighted to be here. Wonderful to be with the alumni. Yes, I've been studying innovation, mostly in the private sector throughout my career. And over time, I've become particularly interested in this notion of frugal innovation, how small teams, sometimes of our students, like Toby and his year mates, can do things that only large companies or the government could have done 10 or 20 years ago. And I ended up writing a couple of more popular managerial books about this phenomenon of frugal innovation, which was about the private sector. But whenever I spoke about these books, people would invariably ask me, so what does this mean for governments? And I began to think about that question. And then as it happens, even in the business school, we have courses, we have programs, we have classes on this topic of technology, what it means for governments, what it means for businesses. We have organizations like CSAP where we have civil servants come in. So over a period of time, I've been teaching these topics, and that's what led me to write about how a government should be and what the role of technology ought to be in a government.
Great, thank you, Jaideep. And thirdly, Stephen Taylor. Stephen is the Chief Delivery Officer at Symprint. Stephen, tell us what Symprint do.
Well, firstly, great to be with you all today. Thank you. So Symprint works in the innovation technology space within the international development sector. My background was 10, 15 years working with NGOs such as Oxfam, Save the Children, and other NGOs around the world trying to deliver humanitarian aid in some challenging contexts. So within the Democratic Republic of Congo, Pakistan, most recently inside Syria, and became, I guess, concerned around the lack of technology innovation within that space. And having worked with very different governments in a variety of different contexts, became committed to the cause of bringing innovation technology to the international development sector. Symprint is primarily concerned with tackling one very major issue. 1 billion people on the planet today don't have an ID. And so the ability of governments to provide services within that context is, of course, highly challenging. So Symprint provides a kind of innovation tech solution to tackle that ID problem and enable people in the world to receive the most critical services that they require.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Could I just ask the obvious question is, what's the real problem you're trying to address here? I mean, it seems to be a usual story we have that governments are somehow inefficient. The private sector is efficient, governments are not, governments are bureaucratic. We've even got, even today, we've got Ian Duncan Smith blaming the shortage of lorry drivers basically on bureaucracy and government rather than perhaps some of the real reasons. So what is the problem here you're trying to solve? Tanya?
Sure. Well, I mentioned just before knowledge and relationships. And, I think anyone that's human will know that that's not just about governments, that's about individuals as well, and organizations and organizational structures as well. But I do think that it is a problem that governments everywhere face. And I come from a pretty contextualist background, so I wouldn't like to kind of suggest that all governments everywhere look and work in exactly the same way. But in an age of informational overabundance, I think certainly we see this pattern that governments often are struggling in terms of working out what they need to know, who they need to know, and how they organize that knowledge and understanding. So as I mentioned, that's partly about the structure of government and how we move beyond often quite siloed organizations that don't necessarily know what's happening in other parts of the bureaucracy. So that's part of the challenge. But it's also understanding, for example, the kinds of technology innovations that are available to assist governments in some of the public service delivery that they do and also in their internal processes. But also this other side of what governments perhaps need to know about citizens in order to ensure that their relationships with them are good. And I think we've seen this over the course of the pandemic quite dramatically. It's been very important for governments to quickly be able to take the temperature of citizens and understand what their needs are and how they can best help to address them. So I think this whole area of kind of knowledge and relationships is not going away anywhere soon. And maybe just to give one example, in a recent survey of cities, so thinking particularly at that level, of 167 city leaders, half of them said the greatest challenge that they face in meeting the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, was actually understanding where to find partners and suppliers focused on innovation that could help them in that effort. So they know that the relationship with outsiders needs to change, and there's a kind of knowledge that perhaps they don't have internally, but even just understanding where to look is a challenge. And maybe just to bring this back to some of what we're doing at State Up, to kind of help to address this, we created a platform which holds data both on the kinds of technology innovations available, examples of use cases where they've been used before to kind of de-risk that uptake by government, but also crucially, we try to pair that with policy understanding. So it's not just about a piece of technology being available for use, but it's also thinking about what are the policy frameworks needed around that to ensure that it's implemented well and in a usable way.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tanya. Jaideep, well, what's the problem you're trying to solve? I mean, you have written a book about it.
Yes.
I've got it here. How should a government be? Available at all good bookshops. So what's the problem you're trying to solve here?
First of all, thank you for that plug, Michael. Yes, so in the book, I sort of look at this question of what, and the challenges for government have just increased over the years. There's so many things that we expect our governments to do, from, the usual ones like delivering public services. In many countries, they deliver key things like education, health, all kinds of other citizen services, to social security and employment guarantees, all those kinds of things. To regulation, big one, particularly where technology is concerned, and industrial policy increasingly. They're competing for investment and all this kind of stuff. Managing the economy, as you'll know, the macroeconomic challenge, all that kind of stuff, ecosystems. So the list of things that governments have to do is just become longer and longer. And that's even before we consider things like climate change, inequality, these big systemic challenges, pandemics, But the ability of government to respond to that has not, I would say. Government structures, as Tanya was saying, remain sort of mired in an old 19th century conception of how an organization should be. It's very hierarchical, it's very command and controlled, it's very siloed, and so on. And that imposes all kinds of restrictions on the ability of governments to respond to these challenges. And of course, our expectations as citizens has just gone up and up. We expect governments to be responsive in the way we expect, say, Vodafone or Amazon to deliver our package tomorrow, to our front door, and so forth. So I think that's what it is. The challenges have gone up, but the ability of government to meet them has not kept pace.
Stephen, what do you think?
Yeah, I guess just to acknowledge that, a number of the governments that we work closely with at Symprint, they look very different. They operate in very different contexts, and their access to resources is very different as well. I think that's a challenge that we see. Look, a challenge that we encounter in our work quite frequently is that kind of ability to keep up with the pace of change and to often balance competing agendas, let's say. So a government's requirement to keep us safe is seeing this trend towards, let's call it securitization or surveillance, and using big data for those type of factors or issues. On the other hand, we heard, that actually data is needed, and positive surveillance in the public health sector, we've seen recently, is vital. And the ability to balance that tension, to use technology for good, is something that I'm passionate about, and at Symprint we're trying to bring to the international development sector. I think what you mentioned in terms of kind of the role of government was very, very pertinent. We see that, yes, to deliver services, yes, to keep up with the speed of change with the right regulatory and policy framework within that. But I think, importantly today, to broker different partners within the ecosystem is important. So to, maybe like privacy being at the frontier right now of human rights discussions, kind of brokering those discussions, I think is absolutely critical. So a challenge with government might be its scope, its role is slightly changing, its ability to keep up with the pace of change, and then in a number of contexts that we work in, their ability to access resources. I think we're very fortunate in the United Kingdom, although stretched and we have challenges. In other parts of the world, of course, the different governments' access to resources, of course, more limited.
How can we make governments more innovative? Innovation is, and you mentioned this, Tanya, it's highly risky to engage in innovation, and actually most innovations fail. And that can go against the culture in many organisations, but also particularly in government organisations where failure is a real problem. So how do we make them more innovative? Tanya?
Sure. Maybe two quick thoughts on that, and one kind of in relationship to what you've been talking about in relation to ecosystems and the changing role of government. One thing that I think is really important is a shift from thinking about institutional memory to ecosystem memory, by which I mean we used to put a lot of emphasis on how government organizations retained memory, learnt from what had happened previously, perhaps went wrong previously. And they didn't always get that right in terms of learning from the past. But I think it's so important today to be thinking about this on the level of ecosystems. First of all, because people change roles and sectors so quickly. And secondly, because as we are dealing with more complexity and more partners and suppliers in some cases being involved in the challenges of government, I think it's really, really important that actually there's that learning across ecosystems, and we remember and also just have the possibilities and the transparency of learning from case studies and examples of often new technologies and new ways of working. It's not just the technology itself, and what's happened, how those experiences have gone. I think hopefully there'll be a lot of learning around this from the pandemic itself. It remains to be seen. And I would add a second dimension, which is obviously, in terms of the ecosystems that are developing, there are many different stakeholders involved or potentially to be involved. I'm really interested in the role of startups. I suspect both of you are as well. And historically, it's obviously been quite challenging for younger, smaller players to work directly with government organizations. I think in areas, for example, like climate change and a green recovery, it's going to be absolutely critical to get the kinds of innovations that those companies are developing into government organizations, being procured by them. Sometimes the state will need to be the first procurer. There are many different mechanisms in terms of beginning to de-risk what that looks like. But just to take the example of green recovery, government procurement globally on an annual basis is around 7.8 trillion, and probably that's a conservative guess. That is a huge vehicle for addressing the climate crisis. At the same time, there are so many startups addressing all kinds of dimensions of how governments can themselves decarbonize their own organizations and operations. But often there's this disconnect. They don't quite know how to work together. And part of it, I think, is around fixing procurement mechanisms, but often the actual procurement frameworks are in place. It's more about the kind of cultural change and knowledge change. And I think pilots can help to go some way to addressing that, but we also really need to be careful not to kind of get stuck in pilotitis, so to speak, and kind of we need to figure out actually how to bridge that gap between pilots and very small scale interventions and a much larger scale use of this procurement power.
Yeah, just to pick up on the thing about pilots. So in the book, I do talk about that, just like startups do it, the lean startup methodology, try something, have a minimum viable product, try it out with the user, with citizens, with other groups, get evidence, and this you can do very well with digital data. And then you look at the evidence. Based on the evidence, you then scale. So that's the theory. But how you do it in practice is challenging. Governments need to learn how to do that, just like large corporations have had to learn how to do that in order to compete with startups. So that's about how government should do its own work. But also, what about the economy? How should it foster innovation in the economy? And here I've been very struck by how the UK does it, for instance, in some areas. So the Bank of England has its regulatory sandbox, where it allows fintechs, which have tremendous energy and potential, but also potentially systemic risk, to experiment with real customers, but in a ring-fenced kind of sandbox, where if something goes wrong, it's not systemic and the costs of failure aren't large. But you've learned very quickly if something can work or not. And you've also learned what the regulatory issues are, what are the unintended negative consequences of this new technology. And having learned, you can then set them free if it's going to work and it's safe from risk to expand, to scale. But you also know what the regulatory issues are. You know what data to expect and demand from them. And you've entered the game very early. And the UK has done that also with autonomous vehicles, same thing, So I think that's what we've got to have more of, a government that's more proactive and more engaged early, but is not trying to do all the heavy lifting itself. That's a problem as well. They shouldn't try to do everything themselves. They should steer others and manage that ecosystem.
Just on this, Jaideep, can governments adopt your frugal innovation approach?
Well, so that's what the book is really an attempt to do, is how to think about how, just as large companies have been trying to become better at doing things faster, better, cheaper, in order to keep up with startups, and try and incorporate some of that frugal innovation that you see in startups, but also you see in areas that are resource constrained, like in developing countries.
Do you want to tell us what frugal innovation is, just in case anybody doesn't?
Yeah, simply the notion that how you can do something faster, better, cheaper. So how you can change and come up with a better solution at a lower cost. So it's all about efficiency and effectiveness and responsiveness.
Stephen, are you engaging in frugal innovation or traditional innovation?
I'd like to think so. At Symprint, I do hope that the technological innovations that we're bringing to governments with, the support of, different donors around the world, such as Gavi, supporting the COVID vaccine rollout, in a very lean sector such as the international development sector, that type of innovation is actually vital. And maybe just a little bit on your point, actually, I wonder if governments are somehow disincentivized to do that. It's the incentive system's not quite right, especially within democracies, where, the election cycle is so short, and, there's risk is inherent within innovation as well. And I know working with governments, who are our funding partners, but also different governments who are our implementing partners as well, if you like. the incentive scheme isn't always there that encourages that innovation, I wonder. A little bit as well from Symprint side, as a not-for-profit, I think it's really important with the innovation space to protect the civic society space as well. And I wonder if, maybe not to be dramatic, but if that's somehow under threat, and we saw the Arab Spring actually, that the tech companies, if you like, those platforms, despite big concerns, which I'm sure we'll get to, those platforms enabled for freedom of speech around issues that maybe couldn't happen in the public space, and there's something positive there. And I think since those movements, we've seen that space being restricted, and I think to the UK as well, the importance of back to the ecosystem of civic society organisations as a key player within kind of that co-creation within the innovation space as a key player that needs to be protected. And I worry somewhat that it's that focus and that attention and that protection, if you like, of civic society isn't always there.
We're just picking up on that issue of civic society. It goes back to something you mentioned earlier, Stephen, about the issue of, I think you called it positive surveillance. What about the challenge of negative surveillance? I mean, is there a danger? I mean, lots of discussion here about the importance of information and knowledge and information sharing and knowing what people need and so on. But isn't there a real danger here about the surveillance state, the danger of information? We'd like to kick off on that one, Tanya.
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe just to echo what you were saying about civil society, I actually think this is a really interesting one in the ID space. I think there's actually quite a dramatic difference where we're seeing ID systems being rolled out in countries where there is a large and active civil society organization and less so. And I think that kind of watchdog, if you like, function is really, really critical.
Absolutely.
And actually, what sometimes concerns me is when policy and technology devices are kind of used as cookie cutter models and sort of rolled out in like ways in very different contexts. And I think this is one of the key differentiating factors. So with donor organizations, for example, I always try to encourage them to think about that local context and is there that civil society dimension. Obviously, there's the regulatory piece as well. I think in many places that will take a longer period of time. And so that's why this civil society bit is so important.
So what do you mean by the regulatory piece?
Yeah, so, I think there are two dimensions to it. Regulation in terms of some of the large technology companies that we were talking about, but also in terms of the space around surveillance more generally and the kind of regulatory approaches that make most sense in terms of striking this balance where we get to make the most of good data, to borrow from a colleague at the Bennett Institute, Sam Gilbert. So how do we make the most of good data that can be very useful when brought together, but also thinking about the limits of that and how we want to shape who gets access, when they get access, what the access looks like.
Yeah, actually, the issue of ID is a really good one to use as a context in which to discuss this question. Because in the book, I actually look at India's big project around giving every Indian a unique ID linked to their biometrics, their fingerprints, and the iris scan. The vision was a very bold and well-intentioned one. It was to give practically half the Indian population doesn't have a way of establishing their identity. They don't have passports, driver's license, even birth certificates. And those are the ones who are the most vulnerable and who are the target of government programs. And they are unable, in many cases, to claim the benefits that are due to them. And instead, you have fake IDs, people, middlemen who've created fake IDs and are drawing down these benefits and therefore perpetuating fraud. So this was intended to eliminate the problem of fraud and also to empower those who are, constitutionally entitled to benefits and so forth. Now, it was, I think, in some ways quite frugal and effective because they were able to give a billion Indians an ID in about 5 years at less than $1 an ID. And in the very first year that they actually linked this ID to some of the benefits and subsidies and so on, they were able to eliminate fraud that was more than the cost of this entire program. But there have been all kinds of questions around privacy and security of the data. And you've seen this in civil society, activists have brought this up, the press has brought it up, the journalists, intrepid journalists have shown how easy it is to buy some of this data and so forth. And then, of course, it got taken up with the courts, and it eventually went to a panel of Supreme Court justices who ruled on what was the constitutional use of this and what was unconstitutional. So you need, even in a country like India, which in paper has all these checks and balances, in fact, it's the practice of it. And it's very easy to misuse or for something like this to go wrong, right? So I look at that. And then I also look at China, which has a very big project, very ambitious project called the social credit system, which is to give every individual and business a credit score, not just on their financial behavior, but also on their social behavior. And this could get potentially very intrusive and can be used by governments against minorities and so on, and can be linked to things like other types of surveillance. And then you need, again, checks and balances, so you need a system that will check a very powerful government that could misuse these technologies. So you really have to look at it in the context of that particular government.
Stephen, you must be facing this problem all the time about the security of data.
Yeah, I wish we had longer to talk about it, actually. I mean, this is very much what Symprint is involved with, like 1 billion people not having identification. And we're privileged to be here today. In many ways, like many of my colleagues around the world, they're unable to move freely because, they're still in the middle of the COVID crisis. And, at the heart of our ability to be here today is we were identified, we received a public good. We have the NHS app. I know there was a lot of discussion around it.
You still got it on?
That's confidential. I do actually, of course. But the application there. I mean, there's public health messages within that. There was a barcode system, the continuum of care that I accessed to vaccines. There was an innovation technological drive during this time that I think has enabled the UK to come out of the terrible situation, well, not fully out of course, but progress through it quicker than other nations. So I think it's important, and at the heart of that is the ability to be identified, to be uniquely identified. It's really, really important. So we need it. For me, it's an absolute it's an absolute vital part of receiving any public service. I think having an ID reduces your vulnerability to exploitation. It gives you status in a society. It means you can hold service providers to account. So we absolutely need a unique identifier. I think what we need alongside that is that we have responsible and ethical data practice. So I think we do. For me, it's an essential requirement that we need, where possible, digital. IDs in this digital era that we're living through. But to accompany that, we need that kind of responsible data, ethical usage, basically. And I think, again, to me, that's back to the civil society, private sector, government, ecosystem and partnership, academia. I think we have to wrestle with the tough topics here. I don't think there is a simple answer, actually, to get that balance between what's proportionate surveillance to keep the population at large safe, because I'm sure there are very real risks within that domain. It's not a space I work in. But at the same time, we need to be able to do positive monitoring of populations for public health considerations, setting good policies that cut through the political divide, and actually policies that are for public good. And the incentives there for innovation would be hopefully addressed behind an emergent evidence base of data for good, ID for good policies.
I'm looking at the questions as we're talking. There's a question about from an anonymous attendee about which governments have done well. Perhaps we could think about that through a good model of governments or governance. Perhaps we could think about that through the lens of COVID. Who you think, which governments have done well so far
So
dealing with this pandemic?
I actually looked that up just yesterday.
You looked it up where?
On Google.
Oh,
As
you
do.
Googled it?
I just Googled, how have governments done? Because I'm not sure I know, and it's been changing. So at the start of the pandemic, we thought Taiwan had done very well. Now Taiwan is way down, apparently. It's just above India and Pakistan.
Well, the metric here is infections or...
So the metric is actually it's called a resilience index.
Okay.
It's the Bloomberg Resilience Index.
Okay.
And they look at multiple things, which is good, I think. They sort of look at not only how is it dealing with the pandemic, so how many people have been vaccinated, what percentage has been vaccinated, what is the level of infections. They also look at your freedoms, how many people are on flights, for instance, taking flights within the country, and what are the restrictions on movement. So I think it's a balanced view. It's like how open is your economy and how are you dealing with the public health crisis at the same time. So they're looking at these metrics, and it's a daily thing. So there's ups and swings and all this roundabouts. Some have been going up and down, but consistently. And maybe you all have your own theories about which countries. It's the small Western and Northern European countries that are at the top.
Rich
Norway,
countries.
Finland. They're rich, they're small, they're liberal democracies for the most part. They're responsive to their citizens constitutionally, and their citizens are probably educated. They probably have a lot of technology and ecosystem.
They have relatively large governments as well compared to some...
And they probably spend on public health as well. But they're also fairly liberal economies, so there's the pressure to open up. So it appears, although, who knows, this may be upended very soon because it's up and down. But that seems to be the pattern.
Yeah. Tanya, who do you think is doing well?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, that doesn't surprise me, that those answers that you came across. And of course, they're not easily replicable models then for most other parts of the world, which I guess is the tricky bit. I guess I would maybe answer on a more macro level, which is to say, at the beginning of the pandemic, I began to do some work on how governments learn from each other. And this actually has turned out to be really, really critical over the past year and kind of a sign of whether they're going to be doing well in terms of pandemic responsiveness, but also I think going forward a host of other challenges. And I mean, this has been a really interesting one. What we found was at the, let's say, the multilateral level, there's often the movement is quite slow in terms of idea and knowledge sharing and even kind of setting shared standards and things like this. But we are seeing a number of countries form groups, which we call digital mini-laterals, which are kind of communities where they get to learn together, share ideas, share failures as well, I think quite critically, in smaller groups, often of kind of countries that share some similarity in values or share a need for specialization in particular areas, so looking at things like artificial intelligence, for example. So one of these groupings that we looked at in quite a bit of detail is called Digital Nations. It kind of grew from a group of 5 countries to now about a group of 10 countries, including the UK, Israel, Estonia, perhaps unsurprisingly in terms of digital government, but also countries like Uruguay, for example, that you might not naturally put into that grouping. And I think that's been super interesting to see because some of the mechanisms they've used for idea and knowledge sharing have looked so different to what you would typically think about in terms of sort of how governments meet and communicate. They've been characterized by huge informality, using things like WhatsApp to share what's going on, and really trust-based interpersonal relationships. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see whether that kind of model continues in a post-pandemic world of getting rid of some of the formality and actually being able to do this rapid learning from others.
Stephen, so which countries do you think done well? Can I just also put a question that's come in from Garth? Garth says, the pandemic surely should have been anticipated much earlier in terms of risk assessment and management. Why can't governments act better against environmental threats such as climate change and species loss? These have been predicted for a long time. So we know pandemics we've had a long period of history of pandemics over a long period, and we know climate change is an emerging problem. Why aren't we dealing with these?
Well, there's a few things within that, I would say. I think public health funding is probably not as compared that maybe to, say, military expenditure. I think there might be an issue there, like our ability or willingness to fund public health initiatives and preparedness. Funding within that is absolutely vital. So I think there's been maybe the lack of prioritisation of funding. I think there needs to be global cooperation on these issues, absolutely. And I think the competition between countries isn't always helpful for managing, emerging kind of risks and threats within the world, be it climate change or preparing for, global pandemics. So I think that I wonder if that's been an issue. Potentially, I don't know. I mean, back to, I guess, an earlier point in terms of absolutely the trust and confidence isn't there in big data right now. I mean, it's that trust and confidence has been broken. And, I think that trust and confidence needs to be built back through, creating the right responsible data usage, ethical, regulatory policy frameworks need to be in place. And then if we can use appropriate data usage to increase our understanding of climatic or, pandemic threats, to create sensible policies that again cut through kind of the political divide, I wonder if that would help. I was actually in Ghana, to the question, I was in Ghana earlier this year with Symprint. And again, success has to be, again, proportionate to the resources. And and there's a big conversation there, but the resources at the disposal of that particular government. And to hold up Ghana as an example, to hear the issue of procurement, how to procure vaccines, one of the most valuable commodities right now. The issue of how to, once the procurement's done, how to get that vaccine to the population is there, and all within a very stretched. Resource scarce environment, which is becoming increasingly stretched as well because of the economic consequences of this. I think we have to hold up, a number of, countries. I've spent a lot of time in Africa, a number of countries in Africa, for, their response under that resource scarcity. And maybe the final point on this, not entirely relevant, but, in terms of using vaccines responsibly, and making informed policy decisions based on the data. We're at a juncture in this country where we're given, third vaccines out, we're given boosters. We're discussing should the vaccines be used, for the younger population at a point where the bulk of the global population hasn't received the vaccine. So I think using data to make informed and responsible decisions for the public good, I think there's something within that as well.
There's a number of questions about COVID-19. Can I just ask, reflecting on those, will the role of the state in many countries change once this pandemic has gone away? I mean, will this be a paradigm shift in some cases? I mean, if you take the end of the First World War, we had a pandemic incorrectly called the Spanish flu. But arguably in many countries, the state just returned to its pre-war position. But after the Second World War, in many countries, particularly this one, there was a major change in the role of the state, particularly the welfare state. Do you see a major shift taking place, or was it just return to the pre-pandemic norms of the role of the state?
I mean, my take is that the pandemic has accelerated changes that we were, expected our governments to be able to implement. It's made it clearer what some of the big challenges are and what the areas of priority are. But it's also made it clear that governments, while the things they have to do is increase, they can't just grow endlessly in size and in their financial responsibilities. I think we're going to see now some consequences of spending too much or growing to be too big, to taking on too many things. Because if you get too big, as we know in companies, any kind of organization, then your ability to respond quickly, flexibly, slows down. You become siloed, you become hierarchical. So I think the challenge for governments has been for a while how to do more with less. This is where the frugal innovation bit comes in. How to do things faster, better, cheaper. How to do that by organizing differently and using new technologies differently. And the pandemic has shown how that's possible because of the pressures of time and resource. It's shown governments that probably, and systems that probably didn't think it was possible, that it is possible. I'll just give an example of our own venerable institution, 800-year-old. You know that we've tried at various points to introduce digital education, and the university was perhaps, understandably reluctant. For 800 years, it's worked to bring people to one place and train them. Now. And it changed overnight, practically. I think you probably have examples from other spheres, but I think that the pressure to change and the possibility of change has become clearer with the pandemic.
Maybe I can just
Tanya.
build on that because I think it's really important to think about the role of the university within this. So I do think that many governments will shift gear or have begun to shift gear in some ways. We'll have to see whether that's a lasting change. But I think one of the questions that we need to answer if that's going to happen is about skills and capabilities, and actually a quite deliberate thinking through of what capabilities are needed within governments and which actually are better placed outside. And part of the skill set will be, well, if you're in government, what do you need in order to collaborate with outside organizations and different kinds of outside organizations as well. So for example, if you're dealing in very complex areas of system management, you actually probably need a different kind of project management skill set because you're dealing with multiple suppliers who have multiple different kinds of knowledge. And so thinking about the kind of changing skills needs within the state is very important. And I also think this goes back to, okay, what about all of these brilliant students that we see coming through the university, studying all different disciplines, all different subjects? And I actually think that we need to be really active in thinking about what opportunities do they have to come together from different parts of the university, from across sciences, humanities, social sciences, and actually to be thinking through some of these questions before they've even entered their professional lives, and to be forming, in some ways, a common vocabulary so that we don't revert to this old pattern of kind of speaking different languages in different sectors or different areas. And so closing that kind of translation gap that I think is often needed in government today.
But picking on that, there's a couple of questions in the chat. There's one about, do we need more STEM graduates? That's an anonymous contributor. And there's another one from Deborah Enzenbacher, if I get Deborah's name correctly, says, are universities failing the world in not preparing graduates who can lead and respond once in government? Given each university operates in a different local and regional context, might we introduce new teaching content, ideas and stakeholder partnerships into curriculum to respond more effectively to a rapid changing setting and ensure that we learn from past mistakes and successes? So that picks up on what you were saying, I think, there, Tanya. Jaideep?
I mean, I may be breaking the rules of this format, Michael, but I think you're in the best position to answer that question because you've been involved with doing precisely that in the MBA in Cambridge, and changing how we train and prepare our young people.
Yeah, to some extent, I think many of us have been involved in this in different ways, but I think it gets back to what Tanya was saying. It's really what's important is if you go into the literature, they have these boundary spanning skills to be able to talk to people from different backgrounds in different sectors with different objectives and different motivations. And that can be a challenge to have those sorts of skills. So you're talking to people in business, but you're talking to people in government, you're talking to people in universities, and understand their different objectives. So I think that they are important skills, but they can be very difficult to acquire. And there is a challenge sometimes in universities that we do get siloed. The big advantage of this university is it's a collegiate university, so we keep bumping into each other, either in colleges or in King's Parade from different backgrounds and different. That's one of the sort of the accidental advantage of being here. You do meet people from different backgrounds, different subjects, and different issues. And of course, in the business school, we're very lucky. We're meeting people from the business community and the policy community as well. So we've got a particularly public space function, a big advantage there of being in the Judge Business School in normal times, and we are returning to some sort of normal times. But I'm pushing it back to you, Jaideep.
Yeah, so I completely agree. We've got to think about how we train young people to deal with these challenges. Not just young people, I should say. I mean, people of all ages, because that's another thing that's changing, is that, you have the need to learn throughout one's life, not just come to university as we conceived it, for many hundred years. Come only for 4 years or 3 years when you're a young person, and that's it. Increasingly, we find we're doing. We have courses, not necessarily degree programs, although we do have part-time degree programs, one that you did, the EMBA being an example. But we also have much shorter programs for certificates, and just for someone to demonstrate that they have a skill in something, let's say fintech, which could be done in 2 days in person or increasingly online. And I think that training, constant training, that's where universities can come in, obviously, and ought to come in, and they need to adopt digital technologies in a responsible way to be able to deliver and reach people throughout their lives. And the other thing I would say, a big plug, is to encourage our students to think of a life in the public sector, not just to go and work in a tech startup, but in a public service. I think you call it a public purpose technology.
Yeah, exactly.
Public purpose technology is going to be really exciting and even more challenging. And Stephen, you should speak about Symprint as an example. It's a brilliant example of that kind of, and so more of our young people should see that challenge of reforming government, improving government and the public sector. So that's my take on that. But
I speak to it in part in terms of, Symprint obviously came out of the University of Cambridge. It came through our founders were based in Cambridge. They were in this ecosystem here, and the linkages that you spoke of, they were in that space. To the earlier question in terms of the role of governments, if you like, it post-COVID, and I guess is it a kind of a positive or negative image? I'm almost concerned that it's shone a light on the inequalities that we had in society already, globally and nationally, and my worry would be that there's a trend towards nationalism, actually, to taking care of our own at the expense of having a global, coordinated, equitable response to COVID. So I hope if one learning comes out, and if innovation can be at the heart of anything, it's greater cooperation on the major risks of our time. When we bring technology to bear on those problems, be it pandemics or climate change. So I do hope that innovation as a tool and a government's kind of willingness to cooperate on these issues will be enhanced further post-COVID. But I'm not exactly hopeful because of, again, the great inequality that we're seeing in terms of access simply to vaccines and resources to respond.
But that picks up a couple of questions that are in the chat about the particular challenges for developing countries. Many of the issues perhaps we've looked at are perhaps more appropriate for developed rather than developing. So I've got a couple of questions if you want to think about them. One from Nicholas Omar says, many of the things discussed apply largely for developed countries and less so to developing countries. For example, digital literacy is relatively low in developing countries. How do you see the change of the role of governments in developing countries differ from developed countries in years to come? So there's that one. And there's another one related to that. Rezvan Ahmed said, what about governments in developing countries? How can they get to a point where they're able to deliver basic services to their citizens, given that their tax base in many developing countries is very low? Great point again about resources and a very low tax base. Yeah. So the importance of developing countries. Who'd like to address those two questions from Nicholas and Rezvan?
Well, I'm happy to start because one of the things I do in my book is to look at examples from around the world. And I was particularly excited to find examples from what one would regard as developing countries, large and small, India, China, Kenya, Bangladesh, which suggests that in some ways, yes, you may be constrained in terms of resources. You mentioned Ghana and so on. You may not necessarily have a Rolls-Royce civil service like the UK does and so on. But you have the opportunity to leapfrog. You can jump ahead, like many countries did with mobile telephony. You can adopt the latest. You may not have legacy systems. And actually, the openness to technology is far greater in some of those countries. They don't think about the downsides. They think about the upsides. They're not worried so much about privacy. Like in the Chinese example I gave, surveys have found that most Chinese citizens are okay with this because they think it'll police bad behavior, and eliminate those kinds of actors from the system. So, I think there are many, many opportunities for developing countries to seize these new technologies and move ahead potentially.
Maybe I can answer by way of what not to do. I've done quite a bit of work in Latin America and the Middle East. And one thing that I very often see, particularly countries receiving donor funding, are encouraged to copy models that they've seen elsewhere. And often, because we're talking about areas of innovation, there's not long-run evidence of what works, and certainly not what works within that population. So I think being wary of trying to adopt kind of very cookie-cutter policy or technology transfer approaches is super important. So it's about learning from others, but very much thinking about the local context and local adaptation.
I'm conscious of the time. There is a couple of questions in the chat about international cooperation, because and we mentioned this sort of tangentially, that we tend to focus on the nation state. But what are the opportunities or challenges for international cooperation? After the Second World War, we had the Bretton Woods system, which had a degree of success in terms of the golden age of capitalism. Do we need a new form of Bretton Woods? And are you optimistic about global cooperation? Stephen, I'm looking at you on this one.
I mean, maybe I'm not entirely. What I'm optimistic about, maybe not at a government level, but the potential of technology to be disruptive in that space, and for civil society organisations actually to have greater cooperation, and the latent innovation potential within these groups, be it startups or charitable organisations, I think is a latent potential there.
Yeah, I'd just add to that, one of the most remarkable things is the maker movement, where people have designed solutions, local solutions, like here for Addenbrooke's, and then sharing them online for others to download and replicate, like repurposing scuba diving equipment for ventilators. They put the designs out there for anyone to download and make locally for their local hospitals.
Tanya, briefly, are you optimistic for global cooperation?
Well, I mentioned digital minilaterals before. I think they can be a powerful vehicle going forward, and I think we'll need that kind of model. But obviously, we don't want an over-fragmentation, and so I think they need to feed into a strong multilateral system, and I'm not sure how optimistic I am on that front.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed. And thank you, everybody, for all the questions. That I haven't been able to answer. We haven't been able to address all the questions, so apologies for that. There were two people who asked the same question. And the question was, do you think Dominic Cummings made any good points about the misstructure of government and the civil service? That was one from Garth and one from D. Cummings. But we haven't got time to address those questions, so apologies for that. So thank you for attending this event. Thank you for all your questions. And particularly thank you to our three guests, Dr. Tanya Filer, Professor Jaideep Prabhu, and Stephen Taylor. Thank you very much indeed for attending this event.
Thank you, Michael.